All right, well, we'll get things rolling here. And we got a little project going on here. It's the dairy beef cross calves, and they seem to be catching on in a big way across the country. Everybody's talking about them, and they're kind of fun to raise because they're not too wild. They're kind of like pets almost. But little background. So this has been, you know, dairy beef cross have really been around for a long time, and growing up in Wisconsin, we've used a lot of them in the past. And we have a dairy cow that wouldn't settle, and so we breed her with an Angus bull, and lo and behold, we have a black calf to sell, and we either feed them out or sell them. And there's been a lot of, I guess, philosophies on how to feed them over the years. When I was a little kid, 40, 50 years ago, Doughboy Feed Company, they had a no forage um, feeding program, and a lot of dairymen use that. And Forma Feeds has taken on Doughboy, and that program is still around, and it's pushed pretty heavily. And in Canada, it's a big deal too to push these little calves quick and early. And it used to be veal, the pale white stuff, but like the Canadian veal, it's a red veal market. They feed these calves up to 1,000 pounds, and away they go. And years ago, when the Doughboy product was being pushed and used, and still is, those calves really, they were out the door by 1,100 pounds, and so they were pushed heavily. And a lot of that dairy calf feeding strategy has kind of fallen over into the beef industry. And the issue is a lot of times here we're feeding cattle to 1,500 pounds, and they start to change a little bit after that, and feeding them that the diet may be an issue. A lot of the background why they're doing it is there's two diets here in the insides of rumens. The one arrow points to a rilage and high moisture or a rolled corn diet, and that versus the other calf on the other side. They're both the same age. They're about 3.5 months old, and the rumen on the rilage calf, you can see that the lining of the rumen is not quite as developed as the one where this calf was on a complete pelleted feed. And a lot of the research that has gone into dairy calves have noticed that, and that's why they've pushed these high grain diets early, because they get a faster rumen development. And in the short term, it's probably fine, and they outperform the other calves. But long term is maybe where the issues are. And so we have a little project here that's kind of looking at that to feed these calves a little more to a normal finished weight and what that might mean. So that's kind of part of the background for these calves, and it may be part of the issues some of the people are running into. Um, here's there's 10 steers in this pen, and I got it traced out. But you can kind of look at what's going on. So these were tracked from birth all the way to their market weight at the end here. And at the bottom, the B weight is the birth weight where these calves started out. These are all Holstein Angus cross calves. Where it says weight on, that's when they were weaned and they went to a kind of a grow yard, finish yard. They're maybe about 215 pounds at that time. And then there's 60 days at this yard, 90 days, 200 days, 286, and then 380 days is about the end where they're going to go out the door. Up on top, you can kind of see what the average weights were for this group of 10 calves. They were tracked with their intake and weights all the way through. But then you can see the standard deviation of this pen and how it starts splitting apart. At the beginning, there's a 14-pound standard deviation with this group. At the end, there's 149 pounds, and you can see the difference between the min and max weights of the group, and it grows substantially. And that there's that fallout that's going on, and why some of these calves fall out. And so I say that's part of what's going, it's kind of the background of the impetus of doing a project like this. So that's kind of what's going on, and you can kind of see just by following the lines. There's this one calf, the green line, and you can see how when he went to the feed yard at where it says weight 200, so that was 200 days in the grow yard. It's about 260 days of age. He just kind of stalls out for a while, and he starts to come back to life a little later. And you can see some of those other calves, they have their issues, and some recover and better than others. And so I says that's kind of the pattern. It's really not any different than what you might see in any pen of cattle. But the thing with these dairy cross calves is we do have a lot of control over their life from beginning to end, and maybe we can avoid some of these problems. Here's another group. This was during the COVID days when I didn't have nothing to do. I had 16 calves from the ISU dairy farm. They were Angus Holstein cross calves. And we just fed them out at the farm here, just kind of see what they would do. This was kind of before it got real popular. And they were heifers and steers. They're all within a month of age. So they're all the same contemporaries. And they were started and put on feed. And then about, well, you can see the heifers were weighing about 929 pounds and the steers were about 1,072. Then we put an implant in them and put them on a finishing ration. And we would expect those steers to just keep going to town and doing quite well. But all of a sudden, somebody had an issue. There's only 8 in each pen, so it's not like a big group. So one with a problem makes a big difference. But you can see how the heifers just kept going right along, did quite well. They gained 4-1 while they're in the feed yard, converted very well. They were all 100% choice or above, so they turned out really well. But the steers, it didn't happen that way, and we ended up with some issues going on. It looked like a lung issue in one for sure, and I don't know what the other one had. But that pulled the whole group down. You can kind of see they did pretty mediocre. And so I say there's these issues that we run into, and why they happen is, I say, part of the reason for doing this. Here's some tracking on a pen of cattle. These are ones we got currently on feed. And there's 2 lines, the orange line and the blue line. And from the beginning, they tracked just as we would have predicted them to. Their growth versus their estimated growth from the feedlot tracking, it matched right up till about 106 days, 113 days in the feedlot. So at this point, they were about 300 days, 250 days of age, and they've been kind of exposed to a pretty aggressive diet from the time they were born. And it looks like, and after that time, we may be having some issues, and where I say that they're not able to keep up with what they're eating versus what they should be doing. And from past experience, a lot of times you'll see this when you start having subacute acidosis problems going on. And there's sometimes with a lameness or a respiratory issue too. But a lot of times it's just when their stomach starts getting wore out. And so they're just not converting as well as they used to. And you can kind of see that's starting to happen with this pen. These pictures here show kind of what might be going on in some cases. This picture on the far left is actually the same animal all the way through, but when the animal died and the veterinarian was out and did a necropsy, right away this rumen, this is the exterior of the rumen wall, and you can see this ulcer that's developing. And when she cuts it open, you can see how extensive it is. It goes all the way through. And I say then you can see the interior of the rumen at this point. And they say this ulcer, you don't see all the damage done to the polyp, the interior of the rumen, but it's starting. It's starting to get a darker color, and you see it already has eaten through. And they say this was a dead calf because of it. A lot of calves don't go that far, fortunately, but it is an issue, and that's part of the reason of this study. The next thing here is there's some things we need to really focus on. And so here's a healthy interior rumen wall. You can kind of see it looks like a wool coat that's a little dirty. And on the side here, this is from a feedlot steer that was on a self feeder. And you can see how dark the interior gets. It starts getting a lot of callus material. And then it starts to have these erosions at some point. And in more severe cases, that black interior is pretty well all gone, and the rumen wall starts to get very thin, and that can cause some problems for the animal. They usually stall out, and in the best case scenario. And in the packing plant too, that a lot of times these stomachs just fall apart, so that can be an issue there. And I say it's been kind of an issue with Holsteins because they are fed pretty aggressively, as mentioned earlier, and say that's something we're trying to avoid with these calves. Of course, there's also respiratory issues. This was one of our calves that had died, and you can kind of see the lung tissue there. It's blood and guts, but there is you can see the red blotches within that lung. And I think this was a mycoplasma issue, and maybe had a few other things, but that's what did them in. And you can see here, this one's got some liver abscesses. This really hasn't been a big problem for the cattle here at the Iowa State, but it does happen once in a while. And out west, it seems to be a bigger deal. And so there could be some issues going on there. But you can see that this one here had a couple liver abscesses, and folks from Texas Tech provided me the picture here. And there's other reasons, everybody has reasons to die, and this was another one. And here's a Histophilis somni issue, and this is actually the kidney, one of the calves we had on trial. And I'm not sure we induced this. I think we inherited the problem when we picked up the calf. But that's a kidney. It's about, I don't know, at least 4 times bigger than what it should be at this age. It almost looks like a large colon almost. But it's sitting next to the rumen there, and you can see the liver at the bottom. But it's infected with this Histophilis organism, and it's really caused some troubles. Here's some more stuff that we've seen go on. These are urinary blockages. Sometimes we think of urinary calculi and water belly. Well, this was a mucoprotein of sorts, kind of in fibrogen, covering the bladder, causing some blockages. It ended up with being a dead calf, and there really was no warning other than all of a sudden one day it didn't look good and then it died. So these things happen, and it may also be part of an infection, but not sure. So I said we had a little project here going on. The point of the project was to assess how the early calf nutrition influences the performance in the final carcass of these animals. And so I say that's what we want to get to without a problem. And so that's what we were looking to do. So we had a little project here. We have 3 groups of 40 Holstein by Angus calves that were placed on trial. So there's 3 sources where these came from. At arrival, about day 60 of their life, they were all vaccinated with the following vaccines: a 5-way respiratory, IBR, BVD, IBR, all that stuff. Then the 7-way Clostridium, and then they're also given some Nasogen. Half of the calves were on a high starch pellet that they were weaned from, and they were kept on that for another 60 days. The other half that were on and I say half of those calves were then kept on that. The other half of those were moved to a TMR. And then we had some that were on a more of a moderate starch calf pellet initially. And then I say they were split in halves too, with half going to the TMR and half to that high starch pellet. At about 60 days of age, they were all put on a TMR. They were then, say we had groups arrive in February, May, and August. So we were going throughout the year. And I say all the calves then were fed in a feed intake bunk so we could monitor individual feed intakes. So I say after 60 days post arrival at the growing yard, all calves went on the TMR. And then after 90 days, all calves were implanted and given boosters with their vaccines. Okay, and then finally about day 200, after arrival, they were put in a feed yard on a finishing ration. So here's kind of how it lays out, kind of lay it out. So from weaning, and then you have they're weighing about 230 pounds when they arrived at the growing yard, and then they were on that either pellet or TMR1 until they were 440 pounds. And they say then about 4 to 5 months of age, they were all put on that TMR1, and then they were transitioned to the TMR2 when they were implanted that first time, weighing about 440 to 750 pounds. And then they went to the finisher at that. Okay, and the bottom kind of shows their lifespan. So the specs on that early pellet that they were weaned from milk onto at the dairies where they came from, you see it was a pretty high protein, 23.5% crude protein, a little bit of sugar, a little bit of starch. The NDF values, you can see the low starch one, of course, had more fiber in it. The fat contents were a little bit pretty close. The energy contents, of course, were a little higher in this higher starch pellet, but still pretty close. The TMRs that they were on, I say half of those calves were split, stayed on the pellet. The other half went to the TMR1 from both of those pellet treatments. You can kind of see here the specs of those rations, how they turned out. And then here would be kind of the specs on that pellet in the feed yard or that next 60 days versus the TMRs that were used in the finishing diet. Okay, and you can see they all were, fairly moderate to high in energy, pretty high in energy for the most part. But I say that's pretty typical, especially if you want to get a decent carcass on these calves so they muscle and don't look too rangy when it's time to sell them. Before arrival, I guess we just tried to make sure that we weren't biasing anything. So looking at the calves that were on the high starch versus low starch diet, you can see there really was no significant difference in their gain. I mean, you can see there's a slight numerical difference that the high starch calves did perform a little better, but it really wasn't that big of a deal. As far as calves being treated for illness, it's pretty close, really not considered significant in this case. Death loss also was a little higher in the low starch group, and but really not considered significant. And then the colostrum, the Brix scores, you can see they were pretty close as well. So whether these treatments really had any effect on the calves is debatable. It could have just been a couple chronic calves, mycoplasma pneumonia calves, ear infection calves ended up in the low starch group. Who knows if that's what the difference was, but I say otherwise by statistics, it's really not a big deal. So we won't dwell on it too much. But once we got to the feed yard, or the grow yard in this case, so this would be arrival through day 60, or their total life, they would have been 60 days old approximately through 120 days of age. You can see the high starch pellet group, the low starch, and then put on the pellet. Those groups outperformed an average daily gain. It's pretty cut and dry. And it really should be, being that initial TMR was only about 56 megacals energy, where that pellet's about 62. So, I mean, we would expect that. Dry matter intake was also fairly significant. And you can see that the pelleted calves, they eat a lot more right away. And part of that's due to the texture and the ability to eat more, because the pellet is very dense. So a handful of pellets weighs about 3 times what a handful of the TMR would in terms of a dry matter basis. So just the time required to eat is significant for those calves started on the TMR. There's the feed to gain, and we had a kind of an outlier with the low starch moved to the TMR calves. So that kind of throws that off a little bit, but really not significant. You can see the statistics there. The percent treated, the percent mortality, also really not significant between groups. At the bottom in green, you can see calves that were treated multiple times, and there is some significance there. That group that was the low starch and then moved to the pellet, there was some more treatments there, and a lot of it may be due to just an adaptation. I'm not sure, but there was a little significance there at that point. I guess I bring this up, these bunk issues. Okay, when we normally we're feeding these calves in the other little projects, we just had a bunk in there, and all the calves, as you can see on the left there, eating. And I say it takes a while to eat a TMR, so they got all day to do it. Where when we were measuring individual intakes, only one at a time could stick his head in the bunk. And I see these little calves are like kindergartners. They kind of fiddle around and play with their food, and they don't always eat real fast. And that tends to slow them down. And just looking at the data, generally calves that were fed in these bunks, looking at other trials, that is, they'd eat about 80 to 96% of what calves that were fed in a bunk would eat. So it kind of limits them. It limits them more when they're smaller. When they got older, it was closer to 96% of the total intake. When they were younger, it's around 80%. So that does kind of mess with our numbers a little bit when we go back to this here slide, why are these 12 versus 6 pounds of dry matter. So that is a kind of a confounding issue here, I think. Okay, but moving right along, so this is 60 days or to 90 days after arrival. You can notice here that all the calves are kind of on the same trajectory now of average daily gain. You can see there's no difference in average daily gains between these groups. The dry matter intakes are about the same at this point. Conversions are relatively the same statistically. percent being treated, not too much difference there. And the mortality has gone away. Nobody died anymore. So looking overall, the first 90 days post-arrival, the weight on feed, you can see there's really no difference there. The weight after 90 days on feed, really statistically it's trending, that those pelleted calves did better, but statistically speaking, it's really not. And that I say that initial boost is going away. Average daily gain you can see overall is fairly close. There are little statistical differences there in the TMR groups, and but they were catching up fast. Dry matter intake, and that's part of the reason why average daily gain was what it was, and then the feed to gain. Now these feed to gain numbers look pretty good, and they do convert well when they're young, but a lot of it I think is fill effects, and especially with the TMR groups, I suspect their rumen isn't 100%. It's developing, and it may be a little bit more developed for fiber at this point than the pelleted calves, but I think there's quite a bit of fill going on, so that may be, so you got to take that conversion at this point with a grain of salt. So day 200 post arrival, so this is when they're moving to the feed yard. Okay, so we look from day 90 post arrival to day 200. You can see these growth differences are going away even faster. Weights are getting closer, and as far as the percent treated and mortality, they're gone too. I think we had all the fallout in the first 60 days, and then we're pretty much smooth sailing. Day 200, then the day 286. So this would be in the feed yard. And they're starting to look like feedlot steers at this time. They're filling out quite nicely. They were given a second implant at this point, and it's a terminal one, pretty aggressive, and then moved to the finishing ration. You can see the performance during that time. So average daily gains are all on the same diet. They're all kind of cooking with gas, and really no differences between the groups at growth at this point. Percent treated and mortality were zeroed out completely at this point. So at this point, we have one group that's going to be going and getting processed here really quickly. You can kind of see what they look like on the side there. And there'll be more to follow. So I say that really this talk today, we're just dealing with this early development and what that means. So I guess we'll leave it there and turn it back over to Erica.